China is very much a work in progress.
Of course, there's an increasing proliferation of literature about China, and at one end we see some people arguing that China has become a new superpower, challenging the United States, seeking world domination. On the other hand, some see China as being so beset by internal problems that it of necessity is self-absorbed, so that the United States will continue to lead the world for decades to come.
Is the next 100 years really going to be the Chinese century? Is China going to influence the West the way how the West influenced the rest of the world, like the UK and the US? What are the internal problems facing China, and what is the future for China?
So the contradictions of China, obviously you have a country which has got a space program, and it's also got rickshaws on the street. It's got the most dynamic economy in the world, but it's also got 500 people who are in an agrarian economy, and China still calls itself a developing economy rather than a developed one. It's notionally a capitalist economy, and yet it is a single party state, so with all the implications for free trade and free markets. And it's notionally a socialist country, even though it's got the highest number of billionaires, or second highest number of billionaires than any country on earth. So there's all these kind of interesting contradictions, confusions, which is probably what makes it exciting.
First of all, I'd like to challenge all of you, the very concept of discussing China as a country. In the business world, I've met a lot of self-proclaimed China experts, and in my view, personally, I just don't believe that any one single person can be an all-round China expert. It is a very, very big country, roughly the size of Europe, over 80 dialects spoken, and the Chinese cities that we hear, like the likes of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou and Shenzhen, they are the first tier cities, and there are so many second, third, fourth tier cities that I've never even heard of, so I know nothing about. So the culture of each region, each province is rather unique, and therefore as a country, China is incredibly diverse. To put it in context, I would imagine the difference between sort of like North China and South China is a bit like you're comparing Sweden to Spain. So today, and so my point is that today, every day I'm learning so much about my own country, and I'm really looking forward to learn a lot more from you guys and then the speakers.
Well, let's start off by looking at where China was at the beginning of this century. In 2000, China's leaders set the goal of doubling the economy by 2010 and then doubling it again by 2020. It has succeeded in the first goal and so far is on track to achieve the second. In the year 2000, Britain and China were more or less level pegging at about 5 or 6 in terms of the world's top economies. But now, of course, China has become the world's number 2 in economic size, about half the size of the United States, 4 times now the size of Britain, so that's in 10 years, 4 times the size of Britain. Last year it became the world's largest trader. In the recently published Fortune 500 list of companies, there are 91 from mainland China and 132 from the United States. How soon China will catch up with the United States is a question for fortune tellers. Goldman Sachs predicted that China would overtake the United States in 2041, but I think that there was something wrong with their crystal ball. Actually, they didn't factor in the 2008 crisis. Now some people are suggesting that China by 2030 will be bigger than the United States and the European Union put together. But like I say, this is anybody's guess. Nevertheless, this is absolutely mind-boggling stuff. However, we need to get a sense of proportion, because China is still very much a developing country. Its average income is only around 11% that of the United States, more or less the same as Peru. It may be the centre of global manufacturing, but its productivity is about the same as Albania, way below that of the United States. In terms of investing overseas, it's still catching up with Ireland. In terms of its military budget, which is around 170 billion per year, it's a fraction of that of the United States, which is 700 billion. And of course, let's not forget that the United States has recently adopted an Asian pivot. So the United States has 10,000 nuclear warheads, China has less than 250. Its enterprises may be large in size, but are lacking in international competitiveness. They depend on core technologies from the West. In fact, in terms of the top 1,400 biggest spenders are on research and development, there are only 9 companies that are Chinese. So of course China has made huge strides since the reforms began in 1978, lifting 630 million people out of poverty, but there are still 100 million people in China living on less than $1 a day, so that's more than the whole of the population of Britain. In terms of innovation, creative design, culture industries, soft power, China is still a global dwarf. There are no Chinese brands that can claim to be household names, at least in the West. The global appeal of Chinese films and TV is highly limited, shall we say.
Without doubt, China's economic development over the last few decades has been impressive, with such growth seizing equality and growing gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Besides, we've not really seen any major economy that has been controlled so tightly by the state for such a long time. So is this going to be the model of other developing countries to follow? Or is China just delaying the boom and bust cycle? And finally, just a very quick point about what is fueling who is funding the economic development. I think, for a period of time, low wages were one of the factors that fueled the economy. But it's certainly, well, in my experience, it's not very much the case now. Because Chinese factories, they struggle. They struggle to compete with the other Asian counterparts who can actually produce it even cheaper than China. Because the wages is quite high, inflation is quite high in China. And Chinese economy, if you're thinking of like the building who is funding it, I think that at least part of it is funded by debt, especially local government ones. Otherwise, I mean, who like $2 trillion US dollars? It has to go somewhere.
Just a couple of statistics. I know we've had a couple of examples already, but just so that those of you who don't know get to realise some of the scale and the differences between the West and China. So I have here, in terms of development of infrastructure, let me just take transport infrastructure, that's what I know. 6,000 miles of motorway has been constructed in the last 10 years, and that will double again by 2020. I beg your pardon, that's high-speed railway. 6,000 miles of high-speed railway, 4 times what the UK has. The road network itself has 65,000 miles of motorway, 5,500 miles, which is double the UK mileage of motorway, was built last year. The 12th five-year plan, which was in 2015, has 85 new airports to be built by 2015. And Shenzhen, which just opened in December last year, magnificent airport, which is 2/3 the size of the total of Heathrow, and that was built from a design competition being placed to it opening its doors on the first airplane landing. That took 6 years. And if you look at the new runway discussions with Heathrow, that's been 20 years in kind of planning, consultation, discussions. And there's a tendency, because of this kind of, can do, will do, you must do mentality in China, that there's lots of literature and discussion about the idea of maybe the problems of democratic debate, the problem of the planning policy system in this country, the problem of actually too many people being involved, and if only we could leave it to people who knew better. So you have this discussion within Greece of technocrats taking over, where Greece is scuppered by ordinary people who spend too much and have too high a pension. If only we can just have these technocrats taking control. In czars or mayors, the big discussion within the West. Even lots of literature, if you go to Foyle's, there's lots of books now discussing the idea of benign democracies in a Western context. The idea that maybe democracy is problematic. First of all, I think that's fundamentally dangerous. We have to recognize the civilizational gains of democracy, and we do ignore that at our peril. But also I think it misses the point, because what China seems to have is a kind of a clear vision about why it's doing it and what it wants to do, which is notably absent from the West. So whatever the kind of formation or the government might take in this country, if it doesn't know what it wants to do and has a clear vision about why, then nothing much will change. And I get a sense, and we can discuss this, maybe I'm overstating it, but there's a certain loss of confidence in what the West, and I use the term West advisedly, what the West has lost and what it represents. The general philosophy of Brundtland, the idea that don't do things today in case it's harmful for future generations. This is the mantra that all school children grow up with today. This is a very interesting philosophy. The idea that we see ourselves as inherently harmful. Don't do things today which may be harmful. Not do things today which may be beneficial, but we see our actions as being harmful, negative, detrimental. And the idea that the West looks to the future with some sense of trepidation, whereas China seems to look to the new century, as we're calling it, with a sense of anticipation. And these are kind of, I would say, philosophical, if I was being pretentious, but these are kind of broader than just purely technical matters. So the attitude of this kind of experimentation and of vision, which you can see within China, then reflects back on a negative sense. So in one sense, looking to China getting things done. Looking negatively, it's always seen, and a few of the speakers have already mentioned it, this kind of the prism of pollution. The idea that, the idea of building more, of using more energy, of building more power factories, of increasing the consumption of the Chinese society, inevitably will lead to more pollution, which is seen as a bad thing. Now, fundamentally, China sees this as we did in the Victorian period, as we saw it in the 50s in this country, as a technical problem to be solved. It's partly the problem of progress that these things happen. When you look back to the 1950s in London, when 20,000 people were killed in 2 weeks, which we forget, it's of a similar kind of magnitude. And pollution is seen as a technical problem to be resolved, whereas you tend to find in the Western discourse that humans themselves are seen as the pollutant. We consume too much, we excrete too much, we use too much energy and carbon, etc., etc. So seeing ourselves as harmful, I think, is fundamentally problematic to the idea of having sufficient vision to actually make a century of our own. So that's my first discourse on under development. Under urbanization, again, I'll give you a couple of statistical examples of 20 cities a year being constructed for 20 years. Since 2005 to 2025, 400 cities will be created. This is all Chinese data, by the way, so you can take much of it with a pinch of salt, but the general tone is correct. Shenzhen, which is built from a standing start 15 years ago, now has 15 million people. This has never been done in human history before. Yes, these are fantastically interesting and potentially awkward and maybe sometimes wrong experiments, but they're still exciting all the same. There are more skyscrapers in Shanghai built in 20 years than in 120 years in New York. And China will build 36 million new homes from 2010 to 2020. So if anybody remembers John Prescott, yesterday's Northern man, he pledged to build 4.4 million new homes from 1996 to 2016. We have historic low house building figures in this country. Okay, 4.4 million. China built 4.4 million new homes last year, between January and July. You were nearly impressed then, with 12 months, 6 months. Now, as it happens, most of them are crap, right? They don't have insulation, they don't have damp-proof membranes, the workmanship standards are low, the design is even lower, and obviously people die on building sites, which doesn't tend to happen very much in this country. But the ambitiousness of that program, the ambitiousness of constructing new cities, I think is something that we ignore at our peril, and actually we do ignore. in the West. In the idea that China wants to be a developed country, which tends to be 80% or so urbanization. It's just reached 50%. It still has a long way to go. And again, if you look at historical comparisons of Victorian Britain or whatever it might be, you can understand that some of the horrible things and some of the dangerous things, but necessary things that happened then are now happening in China. The thing is that the ambition that China has, when you reflect it back on the UK example, the UK hasn't built a new city in a generation since the mid-70s, and that was Milton Keynes. And now you have David Cameron, who's proposing to build garden cities, which is a 100-year-old Ebenezer Howard utopian, some people might say dystopian vision of 30,000 homes within a rural environment. Whereas China is building 179 eco-cities. Again, whatever you want to mean by eco-cities is up to you, but it's now building these eco-cities which have 3 million people. So it's recognizing the necessity of urbanization as a process of pushing forward, that without urbanization, without the civilizational gains that urbanization brings, without the efficiencies that concentrations of population bring, it's not going to step forward. And I think the Western view on that and the Western call for restraint can only be a damaging discussion. It might make people in the West feel better that we're trying to rein in China, but if the Chinese listen, and unfortunately there are thousands and thousands of sustainability consultants in China arguing that they should slow down, if they cave in, I think it will be dangerous for China.
In a world context, I suggest China's rise has so far and will continue to be a phenomenon of a rising tide lifts all boats. That is, driving the rise of the developing world more broadly. It is this multipolarizing trend that is the international game changer and is shifting the locus of international diplomacy and decision making, and raising questions as to the legitimacy of our international organisations like the IMF. In relation to China's role in this multipolar trend, I'd highlight just a few points. Starting 10 years ago, the high-profile tours undertaken by China's leaders to Latin America and Africa, resulting in large-scale trade and investment agreements. 5 years ago, the formation of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The outward expansion of China's enterprises, private but mainly state-owned enterprises, who are taking the joint venture model to set up partnership projects around the world, especially in infrastructure development. And again, I'd highlight the formation of the BRICS Bank a couple of weeks ago, which will be financing such investment. And we're also beginning to see the emergence of the renminbi as an international currency, and that is a currency used for international trade, not for speculation. Despite all this, China is still, as I say, a developing country, especially in terms of soft power and diplomacy. It's on a steep learning curve and is not asserting its views on international crises. And I think those demonstrators outside were demonstrating against Israel's war on Gaza. Nobody cares about what China thinks about this, but believe me, the Middle East is going to be very, very concerning for China in the future, because the United States is going to be relying more on shale gas and China more on oil in the Middle East. So stability in the Middle East is going to be a big issue for China. So finally, I just want to say a few words about us in Britain, because there are those who argue that we should be making Britain China-proof, as if China is a malign influence from which we must protect ourselves. But I'd like to point out two points of view which differ from that. First of all, there's Liam Byrne, who is the Shadow Minister for Higher Education, Science and Innovation, who's written a book called Turning to Face the East. And also the TUC has just produced a report called The Way of the Dragon. And they both argue that China presents us with opportunities, but we must act very quickly. As I've described, China has a growing domestic market. Its goals are to upgrade its technological levels. It's also developing a welfare state. And both of these reports argue that China offers lots of opportunities for us in terms of high-tech exports, joint research projects, as well as helping to develop China's welfare state. So they see China as a source of high-skilled jobs in Britain. They ask, how can we contribute to China's development? How can we partner China globally? They both call on the British government to take the initiative and come up with a comprehensive investment plan to direct us more towards China's growth. There is no doubt that we have been losing ground, not only under this government, but under the Labour governments. Would you believe that Britain is still the 6th largest manufacturing power, but we account for 1% of China's imports? France exports twice as much as we do. Germany exports 7 times as much as we do to China. So we need to be looking at this. We need to be looking at what is holding us back. And part of the answer, I suspect, lies in the influence of long outdated stereotypes of Oriental villainy and a colonial mindset that sets us above others, discounting what their achievements are and what they have to offer. So, why do we focus on democracy in China? Why isn't there more of concern over the lack of democracy over this change in Japan? What about the coup in Thailand? That kind of passed us by. China needs more democracy. I'm all for more democracy in China, but it needs to be stable, and this takes time to build up. We don't know about a lot of democratic practices in China. China has been carrying out elections in villages since the early 1990s. When we started our democratic process, we started with the middle classes, with the rich people, with the business people. They got the vote first, then the workers, then the women. In China, they've started with the poorest people. Now, you talk about all of this WeChat and the use of Weibo and all of this kind of thing. They are creating space for people to use these resources and internet in order to develop public debate. For example, there is a public debate about high-speed trains in China, and I've spoken to Chinese students, about, what is it a good thing, what are the arguments for. There is a lot of space, a lot more space than we suspect for debate.
Jenny, I'm going to stop because I can see people wanting to get in.
Sorry, can I just... just a few more points. So I think that on this question about free thinking and creativity and so on, I think that we must be careful of thinking that somehow the Chinese haven't got it right and that we've got it right and that China is going to become more like us. Actually, I think from a Chinese point of view, when they look at the West, they don't think that we have got the balance between the individual and the collective right. The individual now has developed at the expense of the collective. In China, there's much more collectivism, and as you say, it will take time. It will take time to develop a democracy in a new way, to develop the Chinese ideas about what is the good life. Not simply take the West as a model. And I think sometimes it's a failure of our understanding. I just want to give you two quick examples. One is, I went to a conference in France, and there were a lot of Chinese there, French people there. And some of the French people hadn't worked with Chinese people before. And one of them, there was a problem with the computer. And I was talking to one of the French people, and he had this amazing observation, which was that there's a problem with the computer. The Chinese contributors all gathered round and all talked and talked and talked and talked and talked, and somehow or other the problem was solved. Chinese just go about doing things differently.
Well, I suppose I want to argue with Jenny, don't I? But just on one point, because I think a lot of what you've said, especially about the international conflicts and American foreign policy, I completely agree with. But I do get nervous about a kind of cultural relativism that kind of posits itself as, well, why should we say the West is better than China, and maybe there's a Chinese way, which sounds very pro-China. But actually, I think it's a betrayal of the Chinese people, because I don't think that freedom is a Western construct, even if it came out of the West. For me, it's a universal ideal that I would want everyone to have. And I don't assume that, you know, because you're Chinese, you won't want it as much as I do. I mean, I think it's as valuable if you're in China and as essential, and I don't mean essential for creativity, because that will mean that they can become better business people or better architects, although that's all very exciting. But because it's freedom, and they can do with it what they want, and they haven't got it. So I do get nervous about that, because I've heard it said before, and I suppose that if there is a question, you know, I've had this argument with Martin Jakes as much as I've had it with anyone, but you know, the kind of idea that there's a kind of Chinese Confucian way, I mean, this strikes me to be as unhelpful as the yellow peril stereotypes of the past, where we look at each other and assume that we can't understand each other because of our cultural backgrounds. And I just don't know that that's the way that I would want to understand the specifics of what's going on in China, but there are certain things that I think as progressive humans we can actually say we've got more in common than separates us.
In some ways, I entirely agree with you. We have a UN Declaration of Human Rights. China signed some of it, but not all of it. The United States doesn't sign even all of it. There are two, I recommend checking that out. There are two sides of it. On the one hand, there are all these, what are known as individual freedom to vote, independence of the judiciary, so on and so forth. And then on the other side, there are the social rights, right to housing, right to education, right to livelihood, and so on. So I think China actually does pretty well on human rights when you take in that whole picture. I wouldn't say that there is a Confucian way, but I think that nevertheless you can say that different people move in different ways towards these universal ambitions of the world, and not everybody has reached there.
This rising generation, does it have a sense of its own individual freedom and the freedom to choose?
Well, actually, if we were talking about freedom to choose, freedom of speech, I don't think China is too bad. Whereas in this country, for example, if I tweet something that may be jokingly slightly racist, or maybe I say I'm going to destroy America, as I destroy New York as if I'm going to have a really good time, I will be in big trouble. I find that 14 years ago I thought that coming to the UK to study is going to be so much better in terms of freedom and what you can do. But actually I find that in China, as long as you don't openly and officially criticize the state or the government official, for example, you're more or less okay. I mean, people on the social media, they do criticize government. It's not like that all those things are banned.
The collective spirit that Jenny mentioned, it's a very funny thing that I've noticed that China is actually incredibly fragmentary for a socialist state, as I was always led to believe. You go there and you find lots of incredibly isolated individual responses to social issues of families, of individuals. The whole idea about guanxi, about networking, is very much making sure that your family gets in there first. And it's incredibly fragmented, and you can understand that from the history, very recent history of China, where the state might screw you over. It's only been 30 years since it screwed over most people last time, so it's very much a self-preservational agenda, very tenuous. People are still nervous about going back to that kind of peasant agrarian economy. So these gains at the moment are very flimsy. It's a little bit like Ireland only had 10 years of the Celtic Tiger, and then it kind of had the recession. Imagine what that's like for Chinese, being almost a global dominant player, but it's still kind of on a knife edge. So it's paranoia. I don't think that's going to happen, by the way, but you can understand how people feel very self-defensive about it. The second thing is that the protests that you find and the elections that are happening within rural areas are very much, well, two things. One is the Maoist approach to politics, which is peasants first, urban bourgeoisie comes a very low second, unlike Marxism, which is the other way around, and seeing that peasants will be the problem. Rather than Marxists, you might see that intelligentsia might be the problem. I'm much more of a Marxist analysis type of guy on this issue. But you find that people who are voting more in rural areas are very much reinforcing the power of the state, ironically. So even if they are challenging and having local elections for independent candidates, they're not always party officials. They are voting against polluting factories, or they're voting against corrupt officials. And that then legitimizes the centralized state to come in as the arbiter of authority to reinstate some sense of normality. So ironically, this idea of protest and independent voting actually reinforces the centralized nature of the state. So on that point, the final issue this guy raised here about Japan, and time will tell, things will change as it did in Japan, I think that's a very good example that, it's a good example, but it has a significant difference, which is that after the Second World War, when America basically ran Japan and pulled out in the mid-50s, so when MacArthur had, primed it, aided the economy after the Second World War, and then pulled out, it left two things. One, a reasonably well-stocked money supply. It left a society which had Western interests at heart. And thirdly, it had freedom. It had freedom and democracy in some senses, and independence. So those things, you can imagine that when all those things came together, within 5 years, this is just another creative example, but within 5 years, Japan had invented an architectural style. Okay, metabolism was a global hit, and it had the freedom to experiment and to innovate and to be creative. You think China has all of those technical realities. It has the power. It has the economy. It has the wherewithal. But what it doesn't have is that kind of elementary, independent, creative thinking process, which will allow it to go beyond what the state or what society will allow. So I think that there is a fundamental issue of freedom and democracy at stake within China, and I don't think we can let that go.